This is your daily dose of all things royal.
Mr. Schellenberger, you mentioned that USAID, which has been in the news of late, spending taxpayer money on all kinds of stupid things, is also involved in the censorship effort. And I want you to just elaborate on that a little bit, because this is going on as we speak. I want you to elaborate on that for the committee, if you would.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to understand that USAID viewed this very holistically. And it's important, if you look at the Hunter Biden laptop case, which is an extremely important case to understand, because the FBI was weaponized, then it weaponized the Aspen Institute to brainwash the entire media. It wasn't just that they censored it. It was that they changed the perception of the laptop. They created the perception that it was something other than what it obviously was. And that's what these guys are trying to do. These are called information operations, and USAID has been in the process of taking over so-called independent investigative journalism around the world, and at the same time then training NGOs how to demand censorship. For example, Mr. Aaron's organization has been working to train organizations to so-called flag misinformation behind the scenes. By the way, it's one thing to criticize somebody publicly, which we should all be engaged in.
Yeah.
But this thing where you're skulking around,
you do that all the
and
time.
Secretly, yeah, that's what open democracy is. This thing of going out and like secretly flagging information behind the scenes and demanding censorship, that's completely an abomination. That is not what our democracy is about.
I just want to be clear. You're saying USAID, your investigation, is now engaged in this pre-bunking kind of concept and process that they did with the laptop story in the fall of 2020.
And it's the exact same approach as well, where often what they're doing, for example, with USAID, OCCRP, is that they're leaking intelligence from the intelligence agencies in a very, and not like WikiLeaks where they just dumped it, I think, probably too much without the proper redactions, but they're strategically leaking it and then manipulating places like The Guardian and the New York Times to publish certain stories and control the whole investigative news process.
And we saw this from Yoel Roth's testimony. He testified during these weekly meetings that federal law enforcement communicated to us there was going to be hack and leak operations before the presidential election, likely in October. We had these so that what's going to happen, when it's going to happen, and then they said here who it's going to involve, that there were rumors that the hack leak operation would involve Hunter Biden. So they set them all up. And then Shazam, they set them all up because they had the laptop and they knew what was coming. And when it happens, everyone buys into what the 51 former intel officials said.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There are many issues in this committee's jurisdiction that are top of mind for the American people, like the constitutional crisis that we face when the Vice President suggests that we don't need to listen to the judicial branch, or when the administration takes repeated actions to undermine the Article I powers of Congress. Or how about if we use this hearing to take on the giant profiteering corporations that use monopolistic practices to raise prices and drive out competition? Remember when candidate Trump said that he was vowing to reduce prices on day one? Well, here we are, almost 1 month into the Trump presidency, and not only have Republicans done absolutely nothing to lower prices, but their policies are actually driving up prices, as today's financial data showed. But instead of dealing with that, we're here wasting time on repeatedly debunked accusations of censorship, even as the real censorship is happening right before our eyes. Donald Trump's assault on free speech rights through a series of executive orders that dictate terms of allowable expression and identities, demand political loyalty from all civil servants, and punish anyone who dissents. One of the executive orders requires federal government agencies to, quote, remove all statements, policies, regulations, forms, communications, or other internal and external messages that promote or otherwise inculcate gender ideology, and to cease issuing such statements, policies, regulations, forms, communications, or other messages. This executive order has now been used by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to send out guidance prohibiting the use of terms like gender, transgender, pregnant person, transsexual, and non-binary. Mr. Aaron, how does this lead to direct or indirect censorship of employees in their role as private citizens?
Well, I think it's very concerning, Congresswoman, the idea that in order to receive government funding to do scientific research, to provide health care, to provide community services, that you have to read from an approved list of words, or if you use one of the words that's on the banned list, you could lose your entire funding. You could have to fire your staff. You could have to get rid of essential programs simply to push, speaking of ideology, an ideological agenda. I think that's very, very worrisome and so unnecessarily cruel on top of it.
Transgender individuals constitute a small but important minority of the federal workforce. They serve in public health, economic, and national security positions alongside thousands of non-transgender coworkers. What impact, Mr. Aaron, does censorship of transgender employees have on the broader federal workforce and its ability to serve the American people?
Well, it forces government employees to essentially go into hiding. To have to hide who they are and what their identity is, to feel that they're being watched by their colleagues, to essentially ask their colleagues to erase their existence, whether that's from government websites or from the ability to simply meet with other people in the government who may share their identity. I think it's a massive overreach that's really an attack on all of us. It's an attack on all of us.
Another executive order directs the termination of all diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in the federal government. As a result, staff at the National Science Foundation have been combing through thousands of active science research projects alongside a list of keywords to determine whether or not those grants should be halted. These keywords include words and phrases like activism, equal opportunity, institutional, underrepresented, and get this one, women. Do these actions, Mr. Aaron, constrain academic freedom or the ability of researchers to freely express their views?
Well, it seems to be an insane way to decide what our scientific researchers or other researchers should be studying. The idea of cutting off funding via keyword as opposed to evaluating independent academic projects, as opposed to evaluating, is this a good cure for disease? Are we going to be able to research cancer? And the idea that that could be stymied or cut off because somebody used the wrong word, incredibly chilling.
The NSF funds about 25% of basic academic research in the United States, including critical research on medical devices, quantum physics, and artificial intelligence. What effect does mass censorship of NSF-funded research have on our ability as a country to advance scientific and technological development?
The scientists need to be in charge of the science. I think that's what it comes down to. The idea that we are making decisions about what our research priorities should be by inserting AI to look for keywords. AI can barely handle your airline reservations and get it right, or your searches online. So I think it's a big problem.
Expired.
I thank the gentleman, and I
Yield back. Gentleman from New Jersey is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, it's humorous to me. President Trump's been in for 3 weeks. It's about 3 weeks, right? And you all are blaming him for the inflation engine that was created over the last 4 years. Come on. Seriously? Realistically? Come on. But let me get to the real issue here. And the real issue, Mr. Chairman, is the censorship that happened at so many levels of our government, at so many levels of our institution, in our media. It penetrated every single level of our society. Let's just look at a little bit of what this committee did over the last few years. Look at social media. The Biden White House colluded with Facebook to silence American citizens. They censored satire. They censored dissent. They censored facts they didn't like. It was censorship, and this committee exposed it. And now even Mark Zuckerberg has to say, in August 2024, he said he publicly regretted, he apologized for what had happened because of the compliance that they had with the Biden administration that used the executive branch inappropriately. But let's talk about more. Let's talk about education. Let's talk about our students and our professors. And they came before this committee too, and they told us how they were punished for holding conservative views, different views than the mainstream. And it could happen to you all. It could happen to somebody with a progressive view or a liberal view. It just isn't right. Every view should be accepted, tolerated, and encouraged in education. They were disinvited, they were deplatformed, they were chased off of campuses by angry mobs. At the University of Buffalo, conservative students were physically attacked. At Cornell, a student called for stabbing and raping Jewish women while professors continued to push blatant anti-Israel objectives. Mr. Aaron, I never heard you say a word about any of this. At Tulane, Jewish students were beaten in a protest while administrators stood by. And at Berkeley Law, and these are just a few examples, student groups created Jew-free zones, banning anyone who supported Israel from speaking. Because that's what it was about, censorship, because our free speech is the most powerful tool that Americans have. This is all censorship. The committee exposed it. Let's talk about health care. Doctors were silenced. Scientists were blacklisted. Intel officers suppressed DOD and FBI findings on the lab leak. Remember the lab leak in Wuhan? Impossible. I said it, man, I was mocked that it really possibly and probably did come from a lab and not from a wet meat market. That was a big joke back then. You were censored. You were censored if you had a different opinion. The CDC and the FDA withheld data on vaccine side effects. It was censorship. And this committee, again, exposed it. The FBI, the Department of Justice, remember that stuff? Spying on conservatives, spying on Catholic churches that were going to, spying on concerned parents and labeling parents who were concerned about their kids and going to school board meetings as domestic terrorists. They were trying to censor them and using FISA, worst of all, to go after millions of Americans inappropriately. It was censorship, and we exposed it. The ultimate censorship? The media, the legacy media, which pretended none of it was happening. Most folks never got to hear about it, didn't even know. There's still a lot of Americans that don't know. It was all censorship. And now I hear the other side lecture us about the abuse of power. Really? Seriously? After what happened after the last 4 years? You gotta be kidding me. It's unbelievable. You know, I was talking to a reporter outside before. They said, you know, what's the one thing you regret? They were doing a little bio on me in your years in politics and government. You know what I regret is that every single American didn't have to sit here in these judiciary meetings and hear what's going on to their country. I wish they knew, and they don't, because the legacy media doesn't let it out, barely covers it, covers a tiny fraction of it. I'm surprised we've survived at all with free speech. Hour after hour, hearing after hearing, case after case, I wish they were here. We fought back. We won for now, but we're in trouble around the world. Our country's in trouble. We still are. We could really be losing our freedom. We could be going into a dark age. Mr. Schellenberger, I have questions for you real quick. I don't have much time. Please, just yes or no. Sorry to do this to you. Has President Trump, to the best of your knowledge, ever pressured Facebook or Twitter to censor true information? Yes or no?
You know, I think you looked into this, right?
I never saw the.
Got to do this quick. I'm running out of time.
We didn't see the request.
Okay. Did President Trump ever, last question, I can't get through them all. I'll ask that they'll be put in the record. Did President Trump ever direct intelligence agencies to work with social media companies to suppress damaging news stories before an election?
Not to my knowledge.
Did President Trump ever label parents as domestic terrorists?
No.
Did President Trump ever spy on Catholic churches?
No.
Did President Trump's DOJ ever pressure big tech to silence political opponents?
Not to my knowledge.
Did President Trump have done any of these things? Wouldn't the media say he was abusing power if he had done it?
I'm sorry?
If President Trump had done any of those things, would the media say he abused his power?
Absolutely.
Thank you. I yield back.
Fatality.
Following this committee's work last Congress, a group of advertisers actively colluded against conservative media shutdown. Mr. Schellenberger, what role should Congress, the FTC, the DOJ have in preventing the next GARM from resurfacing and colluding to the detriment of speech?
Eternal vigilance. I mean, and God bless you all for what you did around GARM. I mean, it was incredible. You know, this was one of the stories that we uncovered. We had a whistleblower bring to us something called the Cyber Threat Intelligence League, which was an early censorship effort in 2019. And they were basically taking all of these military tactics developed abroad for counterinsurgency, repurposing them into a new manual a new handbook for how to do it at home, and it included this advertiser pressure, which has been a key component of it. So you can see multiple things are going on. They're creating these supposed non-governmental organizations to then flag information to be censored, and they're putting pressure on the advertisers. They're trying to change the terms of service at the social media companies. I mean, one of the things that Matt just talked about is this group Internews, which we just discovered like 5 minutes ago, which has been spending hundreds of millions of dollars, and the head of it has been out there, World Economic Forum, advocating, pressuring advertisers. That's our taxpayer money going to an organization that's out there demanding pressure on advertisers to demand more censorship of social media platforms.
And so by default, at least under the old regime, the American taxpayer is funding the demise of the First Amendment if we don't do anything about it.
And the good news is that if you defund the thought police, there's not that many there's not many people out there that want to independently fund the thought police. And so if the government stops funding it, we do think it'll shrink quite a bit.
Thank you for that. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
It was such a broad.